War II destroyer that had no business still being afloat. Her captain, a 30-year-old lieutenant who had been commanding this ship for barely 5 months, had just made a decision that no naval textbook had ever prepared him for. He was going to ram a German submarine, not fire at it from a safe distance above, not depth charge it from. He was going to drive his ship directly into the enemy at full speed, close enough that his crew would have to fight the German sailors hand to hand, close enough that one of his men would throw a knife at a German gunner standing just 10 yards away, close enough that another American sailor would grab an empty artillery shell casing and use it as a weapon in the darkness. What happened next, in the 64 minutes that followed, would be called by naval historians the most spectacular surface battle since the era of John Paul Jones. But here is the twist that nobody tells you. The ship that won this fight did not survive, and the men who died were not killed by the enemy. To understand what happened on November 1st, 1943, north of the Azores in the cold black heart of the Atlantic Ocean, you have to understand the world that produced both the hunter and the hunted. The Battle of the Atlantic was unlike any other campaign in the Second World War. It was not fought in a jungle or across a desert or in the sky above burning cities. It was fought on and beneath the surface of the most merciless body of water on Earth, in weather that could kill a man in the water within minutes, in darkness so complete that ships could pass within yards of each other without either crew knowing the other existed. The German Navy's U-boat force, the Kriegsmarine submarine arm, had been strangling Allied supply lines since the earliest days of the war. Merchant ships carrying food, weapons, ammunition, fuel, and troops were being sent to the bottom in terrifying numbers. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 1,600 Allied vessels. The math was brutal and simple. If the U-boats could not be stopped, Britain would starve, the Soviet Union would collapse under German assault without resupply, and any hope of an Allied invasion of Europe would die before it could be born. The American response came in the form of hunter-killer task groups. These were small, fast, aggressive naval formations built around escort carriers, smaller aircraft carriers constructed on merchant ship hulls that could put anti-submarine aircraft into the sky while their accompanying destroyers swept the waters below. Task Group 2114 was one of these formations. It was built around the escort carrier USS Card and included 3 aging Clemson-class destroyers, USS Goff, USS Barry, and USS Bory. These were old ships. The Bory had been launched in 1919, commissioned in 1920, and had sailed in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the Caribbean across 2 decades of peacetime service before the war found her. She was not a young, powerful warship. She was a veteran of a different age, refitted and updated as best the Navy could manage, now doing the hardest and most dangerous work the Atlantic had to offer. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Charles H. Hutchins, was in his own way as unlikely as the ship he commanded. Born in Indiana, Hutchins had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1936, served 2 years on active duty, got married, and then resigned his commission and moved back to Terre Haute. He was a civilian when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He came back into the Navy as a lieutenant junior grade in the reserves, joined the Bory as executive officer in October 1942, and was promoted to captain in June 1943. He was 30 years old. He was reportedly the youngest destroyer commander in the entire United States Navy at that time. His crew was made up mostly of reservists, men who had chosen to serve rather than being swept in by the draft, men who had trained together for years and developed the kind of quiet, unspoken understanding that only comes from shared hardship. They were, as one crewman later wrote, young and eager and a little reckless. They were ready. On the other side of this story was a German submarine commander who was none of those things. Korvettenkapitän Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann was 37 years old, 7 years older than Hutchins, and he had been at war in the Atlantic since before America had even entered the fight. U-405 was a Type 70 submarine, the standard workhorse of the German U-boat fleet. She carried 14 electric torpedoes, mounted an 88mm deck cannon at the bow, and bristled with 20mm anti-aircraft guns arranged around the conning tower. She was fast enough on the surface and deadly enough beneath it. Hauptmann was a veteran. He had commanded U-405 through 7 war patrols before this, her 8th and final voyage. He was well liked by his crew. He knew his boat and he knew the ocean. On October 10, 1943, U-405 had departed Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of occupied France with 49 men aboard. She was operating as part of a Wolfpack-designated Siegfried, then later Siegfried I, hunting Allied shipping in mid-ocean. By late October, the Wolfpack had dispersed without scoring a single kill. Hauptmann turned his boat toward a prearranged mid-ocean refueling area. He was heading for what he believed would be a routine rendezvous. He had no way of knowing that the hunter-killer group working the same stretch of ocean had already received intelligence gathered through radio direction finding equipment that the Americans called Huff Duff that suggested a concentration of German submarines in exactly that part of the North Atlantic. On October 30th, Task Group 2114 received this intelligence. Captain Arnold Isbell, commanding the task group from the flight deck of USS Card, sent his destroyers out to investigate. Lieutenant Hutchins aboard USS Bory was detached from the carrier's screen and ordered to push southward at 22 knots. The seas were still relatively manageable at this point. The crew was in good spirits. Fire Controlman First Class Robert Maher, who would later write one of the most vivid first-person accounts of what was about to happen, remembered it this way. They were young bucks, dumb and happy, excited to be the hunters rather than the hunted. They had no idea that by the time the sun rose again, their ship would be dying. Shortly after 8 in the evening on October 31st, Halloween as it happened, USS Bory's newly installed surface search radar picked up a contact at 8,000 yards. Hutchins drove his ship hard toward the blip on the screen. As Bory closed to ramming distance, the contact submerged. A German submarine, probably U-256, had spotted the approaching destroyer and crash-dived. Hutchins was not deterred. He attacked with depth charges, forcing the submarine back toward the surface. It dove again. He attacked a third time. A large oil slick spread across the water. Though U-256 would eventually limp back to port badly damaged, Hutchins was convinced he had made a kill. He radioed the Card, "Scratch 1 pig boat, I'm searching for more." He had no idea how prophetic that would be. Less than 6 hours later, just before 2 in the morning on November 1st, the radar screen lit up again. A new contact, range 8,000 yards. Hutchins turned Bory toward it and pushed his aging engines to their limits. At 2,000 yards, the radar contact disappeared. The submarine had submerged again, but even as the radar went dark, the sonar operator picked up the contact on his underwater listening equipment, and Hutchins came in for a depth charge attack. What happened next was partly mechanical failure and partly the hand of fate. As Bory passed over the submarine's position, something went wrong with the depth charge racks. Instead of a controlled release, both stern tracks emptied themselves all at once. The entire load of depth charges plunged into the water in a single massive pattern. The resulting explosions were so powerful that they physically lifted the stern of the Bory out of the water. And below, U-405, hammered by a wall of underwater pressure that she could not withstand, was forced to the surface. She came up in 15-foot seas, in gale-force winds, and she could not go back down. Her diving controls had been damaged. Corvettenkapitän Hauptmann was now trapped on the surface in the middle of a raging Atlantic storm, in the dark, with an American destroyer less than a mile away. Hutchins gave the order to switch on the 24-inch searchlight. The beam sliced through the darkness and found U-405, illuminating her like a stage actor caught in a spotlight she had not expected. The effect on both crews was electric. German sailors poured out of the conning tower, racing to reach their deck gun, the 88mm cannon that could punch a hole through a destroyer's hull at this range. Bory's gunners were already at work. The 4-inch guns opened up, and the 20mm guns swept the submarine's deck with cannon fire that cut down the German sailors before they could reach their weapons. A salvo of 3 4-inch shells destroyed the submarine's deck gun before it could fire a single round. The sub's own 20mm guns scored hits on Bory's forward engine room and near the bridge, but caused no casualties at this moment. The exchange of fire was brutal and precise and terrifyingly close. The range was measured in hundreds of yards. In a conflict where naval warfare was typically conducted at distances of miles, These men were shooting at each other from distances that, on land, would have been considered hand grenade range. For 20 minutes, Hutchins circled at 25 knots, trying to find an angle to bring his ship broadside onto the submarine. But Hopman was a masterful ship handler. He kept turning U-405 inside Bori's wider turning radius, keeping the destroyer from bringing her full firepower to bear. The two vessels chased each other in circles in the darkness, one blinded by a searchlight, both crews firing every weapon that could be brought to the target. Then Hutchins made his decision. He was going to ram. He found an opening as U-405 turned onto the submarine's starboard quarter, and he drove Bori straight at her. At the moment of impact, with U-405 turning hard to port to try to escape, a wave, one of the enormous Atlantic swells that had been building throughout the night, lifted Bori's bow and dropped it directly onto the foredeck of the German submarine. The two ships were now locked together at an angle of roughly 25 to 30 degrees from parallel. The destroyer was riding on top of the submarine, and the sea, the enormous heaving North Atlantic, began working them against each other. What followed those next 10 minutes was unlike anything in the official naval doctrine of either nation. The two ships ground against each other as the waves lifted and dropped them, the steel of Bori's hull gouging into the pressure hull of the submarine, opening seams in the destroyer's port side below the waterline, flooding her forward engine room. The crews were close enough to see each other's faces. German sailors on U-405's deck made desperate attempts to reach the few weapons still available to them. American sailors on Bori's deck grabbed everything they could lay their hands on: rifles, shotguns, Tommy guns, pistols. Fire controlman Robert Maher was at the gun director. The 20mm guns kept hammering at U-405's conning tower and superstructure, and in the surreal chaos of the moment, Fireman First Class David Southwick hurled his sheath knife at a German sailor standing less than 10 yards away. Another American sailor grabbed an empty 4-inch artillery shell casing and used it as a club, hurling it at German crew members on the submarine's deck. The official caption released by the Navy's Historical Office after the battle noted it simply: "So close was the range, running from 10 to 40 feet, that even one knife hit was scored on a member of the Nazi gun crew." By the time the two ships separated, driven apart by the same waves that had locked them together, approximately 35 of U-405's crew of 49 were dead or had gone overboard. The submarine's superstructure was, in one contemporary account's words, a wreck. Bori had suffered no crew deaths during the ramming itself, but she was flooding. The collision had opened holes along her entire port side. The forward engine room was taking on water so fast that her engineers were working in chest-deep water to keep the boilers running. A drainage fitting had been jammed open by the collision, and the sea was pouring in. Machinist's mate, second-class Irving Sam, dove down under 10 feet of flooded water in the darkness and managed to close the valve by feel. That act of extraordinary courage bought the crew more time. But only a little. U-405 was not finished. Hopman, with barely 14 of his men still effective, managed to get his submarine moving again, increasing speed toward 20 knots and trying to escape into the darkness. Hutchins turned off the searchlight deliberately. In the blackness, he tracked U-405 by radar, hoping that the German commander would believe the destroyer had broken off the pursuit and attempt a more predictable escape course. It worked. As U-405 turned, Bori closed the distance. Hutchins prepared to ram again, but U-405 slowed and turned hard toward Bori's starboard side, attempting to ram the destroyer instead. Hutchins immediately reversed his port engine, kicking his ship's stern toward the submarine, and fired the starboard depth-charge projectors. The 3 shallow-set charges detonated almost directly alongside U-405's conning tower, arresting her momentum and sending a crushing concussion through her hull. The submarine staggered. She was still moving, but barely. Her speed had dropped. Hutchins closed in for the final blow. A full salvo from Bori's 4-inch guns found U-405's starboard diesel exhaust. The hit was decisive. German sailors began appearing on the submarine's hull, firing signal flares. A man on the conning tower was waving his arms in surrender. Hutchins gave the order to cease fire, but in the noise and the chaos and the wind and the waves, one of Bori's gun crews did not hear the order. The gunner had removed his headphones and missed the command. Several more rounds struck the submarine before the firing could be stopped. U-405 was done. Her surviving crew climbed into rubber rafts. The last man to leave the stricken boat was wearing an officer's cap, almost certainly Hopman himself, faithful to the tradition that a captain is the last to leave his vessel. U-405 sank slowly by the stern at 2:57 in the morning. A few minutes later, a deep underwater explosion shook the ocean, the submarine scuttling charges set by that final officer before he went into the sea. When the boat disappeared beneath the surface, Hutchins wrote afterward, a yell went up from all hands that could probably be heard in Berlin. And here is where this story takes the turn that history tends to omit when it celebrates the victory. The moment U-405 went down, USS Bore's crew moved to rescue the German survivors in the yellow rubber rafts. It was the right thing to do, the lawful thing, the human thing. Hutchins slowed his ship and moved toward the men in the water. And then the sonar operator, Lurton Kent, picked up a sound that froze every man on the bridge. The high-pitched scream of torpedo propellers. There was a third U-boat in the area. It had been lurking nearby throughout the entire battle, and now, with Bore slowed and predictable, it had fired. Hutchins had no choice. He rang for flank speed on his one remaining operational engine. The forward engine room was now completely flooded and useless, and turned toward the incoming torpedo track to present the smallest possible target. The torpedo passed down Bore's port side with feet to spare. In the chaos of the turn, the ship ran through the German life rafts. The entire crew of U-405, all 49 men, perished in the North Atlantic. Some had been killed in the battle. Others drowned when Bore could not stop to save them. The third U-boat that had fired the torpedo never came to rescue its countrymen either. Bore was now in her death agony. Her forward engine room was flooded to the deckhead. Only her starboard engine was functioning. She was taking on water faster than her pumps could remove it. Her electrical systems were failing. Her fuel was contaminated with salt water that had flooded into the tanks. Her speed was reduced to 10 knots, then less. The crew formed bucket brigades in the rising water, bailing by hand in the 20-foot seas because the pumps were losing the fight. Hutchins ordered everything non-essential thrown overboard to reduce top weight. Ammunition, equipment, even the gun director was jettisoned. The ship was becoming dangerously unstable. By 9 in the morning of November 1st, Bore had gone dead in the water. Both engines had stopped. The radio generator was silent. Her position was unknown to the rest of the task group. She was alone in the North Atlantic in 40-foot swells, slowly sinking beyond communication range, with U-boats still reported in the vicinity. What happened next was a story within a story, as remarkable in its own quiet way as the battle that had preceded it. At 11 in the morning, the communications officer, working with whatever flammable liquid he could find, lighter fluid, and, in a touch of grim irony, torpedo alcohol, managed to restart the emergency radio generator long enough to transmit one brief message to USS Card. It said only, "Commenced sinking." Card received it, took a radio bearing, and launched 2 Avenger torpedo bombers to search. They found Bore 14 miles away, nearly invisible in the fog and the mountainous seas. The carrier altered course and brought her escorts, USS Goff and USS Barry, to the stricken destroyer's position. But the seas were running 40 feet by this point. Neither rescue destroyer could come alongside without risking catastrophic damage to both vessels. They could see Bore. They could not reach her. As darkness began to fall on November 1st, Captain Isbell made the decision that no commander ever wants to make. He ordered Hutchins to abandon ship. Hutchins complied. But abandoning a ship in 40-foot seas in 44-degree water with exhausted men who had been awake for more than 21 straight hours of combat and damage control was not a simple matter of climbing into lifeboats. Men went over the side into rafts that flipped in the swells. Men tried to swim to the rescue ships and were beaten back by the waves. Men who had survived an hour-long hand-to-hand battle with a German submarine, who had dove under 10 feet of flooded water to close a valve, who had thrown knives at their enemies in the dark. Those men were unable to get over the side of the rescue destroyers in the conditions of that night. Hutchins reported afterward, with the flatness of a man who could not allow himself to feel the full weight of what he was saying, that many of the lost were simply unable to get over the side. 3 officers and 24 enlisted men died during the rescue operation. None of Bore's crew had been killed by the enemy during the battle itself. The ocean killed them. Bori herself was still afloat at dawn on November 2nd. Barry and Goff tried to sink the hulk with torpedoes to prevent the Germans from capturing anything of intelligence value, but the torpedoes ran off course in the heavy seas. They tried 4-inch gunfire. The shells struck home, but the ship refused to die quickly. In the end, the escort carrier Card launched her Avenger torpedo bombers one more time, and they put the USS Bori under with aerial bombs. The ship that had defeated a German submarine in hand-to-hand combat was sunk by her own side's aircraft to keep her out of enemy hands. The survivors were brought aboard USS Card. A memorial service was held on the carrier's flight deck. On November 10, 1943, in a ceremony on that same flight deck, Lieutenant Charles Hutchins received the Navy Cross. The other commanding officers of the task group received the Legion of Merit. Task Group 21.14 as a whole received the Presidential Unit Citation, awarded for what the citation described as extraordinary performance during anti-submarine operations. Hutchins was 30 years old. He had been commanding a destroyer for less than 6 months. He had lost his ship, 27 of his men, and he had won one of the most unusual naval engagements in the history of the United States Navy. The citation recognized this without quite being able to capture the reality of it in official language. The reality was that for 64 minutes in the middle of a North Atlantic storm, men from Indiana and everywhere else had fought Germans from Danzig and everywhere else with knives and shell casings and rifles and shotguns at a range of 10 to 40 feet in rolling, heaving seas in the darkness before dawn, and the Americans had won. They had lost their ship winning it. They had lost 27 men winning it, and every single German sailor who had been aboard U-405 was dead. The story of USS Bori is a story about what happens when trained, determined men face a situation that no training can fully prepare them for, and they adapt. It is a story about the peculiar courage of men who understood that their ship was dying and kept fighting anyway. It is a story about a commander who was barely old enough to have been a commander at all, making decisions in the dark at 25 knots in a 40-foot sea that military historians would study decades later. But it is also, if you look at it carefully, a story about the cost of victory, about how the men who paid the price were not always the men who fired the last shot. Hutchins won his battle in 64 minutes. The Ocean took 27 of his men in the hours that followed. The villain in this story is not Korvettenkapitän Hoppmann, who fought with skill and courage to the end and who went down with his men. The villain, if there is one, is the indifferent violence of war itself, the arithmetic of destruction that assigns value to ships and tactics and strategic objectives without accounting for the men doing the fighting and dying to achieve them. If stories like this one matter to you, stories of men pushed past the limits of what should be survivable, making choices no rulebook anticipated, winning and losing simultaneously in the same 64 minutes, then this channel is where you belong. Subscribe, hit the bell, because there are hundreds of stories exactly like this one sitting in the archives waiting to be told.